The jungle has a way of swallowing sound. In Guyana, the trees press close together, their canopies blotting out the sun, the air heavy with heat and rain. It was here, deep in this isolation, that the People's Temple built their so-called paradise, a promised land of equality and hope, carved out of the wilderness. But paradise has a way of rotting from within. They called it Jonestown. At first glance, it looked like a settlement of dreamers. Cabins arranged in neat rows, gardens tended by hand, children darting between open spaces. A pavilion stood at the heart of it all, the stage from which Jim Jones preached his gospel. He spoke of justice, of unity, of a community free from the corruption of America. His followers, almost 1,000 of them, believed him. They had left their old lives behind, convinced that here, at the end of the earth, they would finally belong. But belonging came with rules. The days began early, the work was backbreaking, and meals were meager. Letters home were censored. Guards watched from the tree line. The loudspeakers carried Jones's voice day and night. Sometimes sermons, sometimes tirades, sometimes only paranoid rambling. What had been promised as freedom began to feel like a prison without walls. By November of 1978, cracks had spread through the foundation. Relatives in the United States begged for their loved ones' return. Defectors whispered of mistreatment, of Jones's growing instability. And when Congressman Leo Ryan flew to Guyana with journalists and concerned family members, it set in motion the last terrible day. At the Port Kaituma airstrip, chaos erupted. Ryan and 4 others were gunned down by Temple loyalists, shot in broad daylight. Survivors scattered, hiding in the tall grass as the sound of gunfire echoed into the trees. Back in Jonestown, Jones gathered his people in the pavilion. Recordings from that night still exist. His voice trembled, commanding, desperate.
Take our life from us. We laid it down. We got tired. We didn't commit suicide. We committed an act of revolutionary suicide, protesting the conditions of an inhumane world.
Plastic cups were filled. Some drank willingly, others were forced. Children went first, their cries carried into the night until, one by one, their voices fell silent. Maria Katsaris, one of Jones's closest aides, tried to calm the panic. Survivors later recalled her words.
The children are not crying from pain. It's just a little bitter tasting.
But the truth was undeniable. Cyanide mixed with a vat of sweet drink burned its way through the community. People staggered into the mud, clutching their throats. Mothers pressed poisoned cups to the lips of their babies. Some resisted and were injected. Some tried to run, but the guards stood watch, rifles in hand. By nightfall, Jonestown was silent. More than 900 bodies lay scattered across the jungle clearing, their bright clothing stark against the wet earth. Only a handful survived. Those who slipped into the jungle, those who hid, those who were away on errands that day. One of them, an elderly woman named Hyacinth Thrash, awoke the next morning under her bed to find the community she had joined reduced to corpses. Jonestown was meant to be a utopia. Instead, it became the largest single mass death of American civilians until September 11th, 2001. James Warren Jones was born on May 13th, 1931, in Crete, Indiana. His childhood was marked by poverty, isolation, and a fascination with religion. Neighbors remembered him as an odd boy, obsessed with sermons, with death, with the rituals of the church. He preached to other children in barns and backyards, conducting mock funerals for animals. As he grew older, Jones's charisma sharpened. He became a student of both Pentecostal fire and brimstone preaching and socialist politics. In the 1950s, he founded the first iteration of the People's Temple in Indianapolis, blending gospel fervor with progressive activism. His congregation was racially integrated at a time when that was rare, and for many, his message of unity was intoxicating. By the mid-1960s, Jones relocated the temple to California, chasing growth and influence. In San Francisco, he built connections with politicians, community leaders, and the press. He presented himself as a champion of civil rights, a man fighting poverty and racism. At his height, Jones's influence was such that he was appointed to the San Francisco Housing Authority in 1976. But behind the veneer of charity, darker currents ran. Former members later described intimidation, staged healings, and a growing obsession with loyalty. Defectors were branded as traitors. Punishments grew harsher. Paranoia became the constant undertone of life within the temple. By the mid-1970s, facing increasing scrutiny from journalists and the government, Jones looked for escape. His solution was a settlement in the jungles of Guyana, South America. He called it Jonestown. For his followers, it was presented as utopia. For Jones, it was a stage, an isolated theater where his control would be absolute. They weren't just cultists. They were mothers and fathers, professionals, dreamers, people who believed they were building something real. And in their own words, the reason they followed and stayed revealed more terror than any outside perspective could. One of the most haunting lines comes from Deborah Layton, a former People's Temple member and one of the few survivors. In her memoir, Seductive Poison, she wrote,
"Nobody joins a cult. Nobody joins something they think's gonna hurt them. You join a religious organization, you join a political movement, and you join up people that you really like."
In other words, the seeds of trust, of community, are real. People don't sign on believing they'll be trapped or destroyed. Scholars studying People's Temple also note that Jones's appeal often came in a subtle way.
No one listening, even those who were the most devoted to him, could take it all in. But at some point, each follower heard something that reaffirmed his or her personal reason for belonging to the People's Temple.
So Jones tailored to the individual's hopes, needs, fears. For one, racial equality. For another, belonging. For someone else, escape from poverty or loneliness. One survivor reflected on how the internal world of Jonestown aged them overnight.
People's Temple kept me young, but Jonestown aged me tremendously. On November 17th, 1978, I was 21 years of age. On November 18th, I was 40 years old.
Not everyone accepted things unthinkingly. In the final gathering at the pavilion, one woman stood and refused to be silenced. Her name was Christine Miller. While Jones insisted that death was the only path left, Miller raised her voice against him.
I said, "I'm afraid to die."
I don't
By
think
no
you are.
means.
I don't think you are.
But I look at our babies and I think they deserve to live.
I agree.
You know, when we destroy ourselves, we're defeated. We let them, the enemy, defeat us.
Her words rang out across the crowd, a rare, desperate act of defiance. But Jones dismissed her, and the momentum of the crowd swallowed her resistance. Christine Miller died in Jonestown that night, one of the only voices to openly argue for life in a place that had already surrendered to death. When the jungle fell silent, Jonestown was no longer a community. It was a grave. On the morning of November 19th, 1978, Guyanese soldiers entered the settlement. What they found defied comprehension. Bodies stretched in rows, piled atop one another. Bright clothing stark against the mud. Mothers clutching their children, entire families still locked in each other's arms. One soldier later recalled the eerie stillness.
You couldn't tell who was alive and who was dead. So many were face down, lying as if they were sleeping.
The death toll was staggering. Over 900 men, women, and children lay dead in the clearing. The single largest loss of American civilian life for many years to come. Journalists arriving soon after described a scene of overwhelming horror. NBC cameraman Bob Brown, who had been shot at the airstrip the day before, had captured his last moments on film. His camera was recovered, bloodstained, containing evidence of the ambush. Rescue workers faced another grim reality: a tropical heat. Within hours, decomposition set in. The stench of cyanide and decay clung to the air, making recovery almost unbearable. U.S. military personnel were eventually flown in to assist, using helicopters to ferry bodies out of the jungle. Among the dead was Jim Jones himself, found behind the pavilion with a gunshot wound to the head. Whether he pulled the trigger or someone else did remains uncertain. Only a handful survived. For them, survival was complicated by grief. Survivor Odell Rhodes, who escaped through the bush, later explained that the whole ordeal was unnaturally quiet.
No, it wasn't that much noise. I mean, children were crying, they were going through convulsions, and some of the grandparents and parents were, getting hysterical as they saw the children die. But basically, a lot of the people were sitting, especially the senior people were just sitting and just waiting or watching,
News of the massacre reverberated around the world. Newspapers carried images of the pavilion strewn with bodies. Radio stations played excerpts of Jones's final recording. And the phrase, "drinking the Kool-Aid," a grim shorthand born of this tragedy, slipped into popular culture, forever distorting the enormity of what happened. But for the families who lost children, parents, siblings, and friends, there was no metaphor, only loss. Jonestown was meant to be a utopia. In the end, it became a symbol of how devotion can be twisted, how hope can be weaponized, and how one man's paranoia destroyed nearly 1,000 lives in a single night. To understand Jonestown, you have to understand the beliefs that held it together. For Jim Jones and his followers, the People's Temple was never just a church. It was a political experiment, a living manifesto carved into the jungle. Racial equality was at the heart of it. Jones preached integration and justice in the 1950s, when segregation still scarred America. Many African American members saw him as a rare white leader who truly fought alongside them. In this, the temple offered hope, a community where race and class lines were erased. But Jones layered that hope with Marxist ideology. In countless temple meetings and in Jonestown itself, he praised communism and attacked capitalism. He read aloud from Lenin and Marx, praised Cuba's revolution, and insisted that the United States was collapsing into fascism. On the infamous death tape, his words framed the final act as political resistance.
And I'm sure that they'll pay for it. They'll pay for it. This is a revolutionary suicide. This is not a self-destructive suicide. So they'll pay for this. They brought this upon us, and they'll pay for that. I leave that destiny to them.
Jones also pointed his followers towards the Soviet Union as an imagined refuge. In fact, during the last year of Jonestown, delegations had visited the Soviet embassy in Georgetown, Guyana, seeking asylum. Christine Miller's final plea, "Is it too late for Russia?" echoed those real efforts. Daily life in Jonestown was steeped in this ideology. Members worked long hours in collective farming, and evenings were consumed with political lectures. Jones railed against the U.S. government, calling it the enemy, while holding up socialism as the path to survival. But beneath the language of liberation was control. The slogans, the long nights of indoctrination, the White Knight suicide drills, all kept followers bound to Jones's vision. What had begun as a dream of equality and justice became a cage, sealed by fear and paranoia. For many members, the motivations were genuine: to live in peace, to build something better. For Jones, it became a stage for his obsession with power, and ultimately for the final, fatal act of revolutionary suicide. Jonestown was not built overnight. It began with hope, the promise of belonging, the words of a man who spoke to the lost and the overlooked. But hope turned to fear, and fear to death. In the end, nearly 1,000 voices were silenced in the jungle, silenced by loyalty, by desperation, by one man's hunger for control. And yet, their voices still echo. On that final tape, in the words of Christine Miller refusing to give in, and in Jim Jones's command that death was the only answer. Jonestown was meant to be a paradise. Instead, it became a warning that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not found in shadows, but in the promises we choose to believe.